Catelyn Stark had learned from her own girlhood and her years at court that there were two kinds of power in the Seven Kingdoms: the power that announced itself like a fanfare, and the power that worked quietly in the background, weaving alliances through words and timely gestures. It was the second kind that had always most appealed to her, for the fanfare was fleeting and inevitably drew every eye. More often than not, those eyes belonged to predators waiting for a single misstep. She understood, in her bones, how a woman could arm her family with far subtler weapons than swords and spears. After Ned was taken, she swore she would use everything she'd learned to make her son Robb not only a capable leader, but one who would outwit every lord and usurper that sought to break the North. In the cold halls of Winterfell, before it was time to march, she found him standing by a window in the Great Keep, looking out across the snow-blanketed courtyard. He was 17, but there was a quiet resolve about him that had settled over the past moon's turn. He held Grey Wind's head in his hands, rubbing gently behind the direwolf's ears. The beast was large and fierce, but devoted to him. Catelyn watched them in silence for a moment, marveling at how swiftly a boy could grow into a man when tragedy demanded it. Yet she knew that raw courage was never enough. The men who would follow Robb, great lords like the great Jon Umber and Rickard Karstark, were as proud as the North itself. Her son would need more than presence. He would need to move like a king on a Syvas board, anticipating the enemy's every possibility. She recalled the subtle dances of courtesy and cunning in the Red Keep before Robert's rebellion, during her time as a ward of Hoster Tully's household, and then as Ned Stark's lady in King's Landing. She had never wanted to relive those intrigues, yet the moment demanded them. She stepped forward, set a hand on Robb's shoulder, and murmured, "If you go to war as a wolf snapping at all corners, you will be outmatched. Let us not forget how this game is played." He turned to her, a flicker of uncertainty in his gray eyes. "I have to rescue Father, and once we have him safe, we'll return to the North. Or perhaps, if it's true that Joffrey has already had him executed." His voice caught, but he steadied himself. "Then I must avenge him. The men demand it. The banners are called. The harvest must be stored. Men speak of war, of forcing the Lannisters to kneel. I know only that I must lead." His words were honest, but there was the tremor of youth beneath them. Catelyn nodded. She did not let her own eyes betray her grief or her fear. "You must lead, yes, but you must lead with more than anger." She placed her other hand over his. "To go south simply because your blood burns is to lose. We must choose where to strike, how to lure the Lannisters into traps, and when to offer alliances. No war is won by swords alone." "I don't know if I can do it as Father would," Robb said. "He was always so certain." She smiled sadly. "Your father is the noblest man I ever knew, but even he would concede that in a war of politics, cunning is as important as honor. You have your father's loyalty in you. Our men see it. Now you must show them something else, a deftness with strategy, a willingness to outmaneuver rather than meet your foes head-on. You are a Stark, but you are also Tully. Remember that." Robb's eyes flickered to her face, and she saw the realization that, yes, she had once been trained in these more subtle arts. At her father's side, Catelyn had witnessed how the Tullys allied themselves with the Baratheons and the Starks in Robert's rebellion. She had glimpsed the cunning of men like Lord Baelish, a cunning that could be turned to terrible ends if left unchecked. There were lessons among the tragedies. Grey Wind let out a low growl, and Robb scratched behind the direwolf's ear. "I will. I promise you, Mother." Catelyn said nothing further, only offered him a gentle smile. She knew then that the seeds were planted. He would listen, perhaps not always, perhaps not perfectly, but she had found her place at his side. They would march south, but they would do so with a plan formed from both steel and strategy. By the time the northern bannermen assembled, the courtyard echoed with the clang of arms and the braying of war horses. Catelyn walked among the men, speaking with the lords and knights, ensuring they felt recognized. It was not her husband's style. Ned had always been more reserved, and the men adored him for his stoic honor. But Catelyn recognized a different need. A personal word, a mention of a family name, a memory from the last time they visited Winterfell. Such things bound them more strongly to the cause. She saw the men look upon her with respect, and saw how their eyes shifted to Robb, who moved through the crowd as well. They noticed that mother and son were of one mind. Even the great Jon, towering over them all, greeted her with a deep inclination of his head before speaking with Robb, and Roose Bolton, with his pale eyes and quiet manner, offered a subtle bow. The North was uniting, bound by blood, honor, and a sense that something bigger was afoot than just another border clash. When the army rode south, Catelyn found herself by Robb's side. She surveyed the lines of steel and leather, the ring of shields moving across the winding roads of the neck. Winding through the bogs and causeways, they kept wary eyes out for the Crannogmen's watchers. She thought of Ned, remembering how he had once told her that the real danger was rarely from straightforward battle. It came in moments of respite, moments when men rested or feasted, believing themselves safe. That was when the knife slid between ribs. Robb let her counsel guide him. When whispers arose that the phrase might close the twins to them unless there was proper negotiation, he did not rush forward in anger. Instead, he sent her. Catelyn rode ahead with a small escort. She found Lord Walder Frey in his hall, a frail and cunning old man, ringed by his brood of descendants. She remembered from her girlhood visits that Walder Frey was never to be trusted, and that he was always eager for advantage. She played the game with a cool smile, kneeling before him and offering courtesy. "You seek to cross my bridge with an army, Lady Stark?" Walder Frey said, voice reedy and sharp. He lounged on his high seat, leering. "My ancestors built these fortifications. My forefathers have held them for generations. I will not give it away cheaply, with the Lannisters bearing their fangs in the south." "I never expected you to," Catelyn said. "But let us reason. The North has come to avenge the Lord of Winterfell, my lord husband, and to free the Riverlands from Lannister incursion. And you, my lord, how do you fare with the Lannisters so near?" Walder Frey's eyes glittered. "The Lannisters are no friends of mine, but they haven't insulted me as your father did, my lady, or that Tully of Riverrun who dismissed me from his councils as though I were some hanger-on." He glared, but his tone was measured. "What do you offer me in exchange for a free crossing?" Catelyn had already discussed this thoroughly with Robb and with certain trusted advisors. "We can offer alliances," she said, careful. "We can offer stronger ties between our houses. We know House Frey has grown in might. Your children are so many and so capable." Lord Walder snorted. But I need them well married." Then he regarded her sharply. "Your eldest daughter is betrothed to the late King Robert's brood? Or was that arrangement undone with your husband's death? Some say she's in the capital, betrothed to Joffrey. Sansa's betrothal is uncertain now that the Lannisters have turned on us," Catelyn said, careful not to betray her anguish. "My younger daughter is also in King's Landing and thus beyond my reach. But I do have sons who will one day be in need of wives. And I have a king in the north who might see the wisdom of such an alliance." She paused. "Though that is a matter to be discussed with Robb himself. He knows your crossing is essential." Walder Frey's grin was almost lecherous, though he pretended to hide it. "Yes, well, let us see. The king in the north, is he?" "He's not crowned yet, but I suppose that can be done after he proves victorious." His watery gaze flickered over her. "Very well. Let us say that if your son the king consents to a betrothal with one of my granddaughters, one that meets my standards, I will grant safe passage. And I will send a small complement of Frey men to aid in your fight. Perhaps a strong demonstration of your good faith would be an immediate betrothal, yes." She knew Walder Frey was always fishing for the best terms, but she also knew how precarious the situation was. Robb had insisted that no price was too high for crossing the twins without bloodshed. Yet a truly cunning mind sought to pay a price that would not bankrupt them later. "We can discuss the specifics once your men have fought with us. Deeds, not words, Lord Walder. If we find that your men prove their loyalty in the field, I believe Robb will be more than willing to fulfill the match as you see fit." He cackled softly. "Oh, indeed. If he wants my bridge, you can be sure he'll have to do more than talk." But for now, let me not tarry. The crossing is yours, with the understanding that the boy king weds my Roslyn, or perhaps Arwilla or fair Valda. We'll see which one suits him. And of course I'll send 200 men, or 150 if that suits me better. So be it. My steward will show your army across. I have your word as a Tully and a Stark on this arrangement." She gave it, her heart hammering with the knowledge that they had pledged something big. Even so, Catelyn vowed to keep a close eye on House Frey, ensuring that if Walder Frey's demands grew more outrageous, they could renegotiate in the shadow of victory, rather than from a position of desperation. Thus, the North crossed the twins, and Robb thanked his mother for her craft. She saw the relief in his eyes. He had dreaded that Walder Frey's arrogance might force them to storm the fortress, or find a more dangerous path through the mountains. Instead, they carried on, closer now to the lands that had once been Catelyn's home. They arrived at Riverrun under threat. Jaime Lannister had set siege to the Tully stronghold, but the sudden arrival of the Stark host surprised him. Rather than attacking recklessly, Robb studied the situation. Catelyn stood with him and a select group in a small forest clearing overlooking the golden fields that stretched toward the castle. The clang of distant steel punctuated the air like a grim heartbeat. Riverrun's banners snapped in the wind upon its walls, battered but defiant. The Lannister tents lay along the southern bank of the Red Fork, forming a ring of bright crimson around the fortress. "I want to lure them into a trap," Robb said quietly, kneeling to trace lines in the damp earth. "If we charge directly at Jaime's lines, he'll pull back into better formation. He may even retreat behind siege lines that we can't easily break. Then our advantage is lost." Catelyn lowered herself beside him, ignoring the dampness seeping into her skirts. "He's brash, but not foolish. A direct assault might cost him more men, but with the greater part of House Lannister behind him, he can afford losses if it means stalling us long enough for Tywin Lannister to come up from the south. We need to catch him off balance." Ricard Karstark muttered his agreement. The Great John spat to one side, eager for blood, but even he nodded. "A cunning plan, then, my lord," the Great John said. "But we can't be timid." Robb's eyes flickered to his mother. She gave him a nod, a silent encouragement. "We'll feign a smaller force on the western side of Riverrun, across the river," Robb continued. "Make them think that's our main approach. Meanwhile, we hide the bulk of our cavalry in the thick forest to the east. When Jaime rides out to break the smaller force, we sweep in with the cavalry from behind, cutting off his retreat to camp." Several of the lords exchanged glances. Roose Bolton spoke in a quiet, measured tone. "The plan could work, but we will need perfect timing. If we move too soon or too late, we risk being caught between Jaime's main force and the Red Fork. That river is not forgiving," Catelyn murmured. "We must also ensure that once Jaime engages, he does not suspect the true trap until it is too late. That means feinting weakness in our forward lines, letting them appear sloppy, disorganized." Robb stood. "Ser Edmure is holed up in Riverrun with whatever men remain. He'll see our banners and may attempt to sally. We must time our feint with any movement from the castle so Jaime cannot guess which is the bigger threat. We'll coordinate by messenger." She recognized a steel in Robb's voice, a confidence she had longed to see. "Then let us prepare," Catelyn said, standing. "I will speak with your uncle, advise him to make a show of aggression once he sees the banners on the western approach. But only a show. He mustn't commit every man, or Jaime might sense the ruse." Robb grasped her arm gently. "Be careful, mother. If you ride around to the castle walls, you risk being spotted by Lannister outriders." "I will be," she promised. The plan was set in motion swiftly. Catelyn rode with a small escort by secret ways near the edge of the river, circumventing Lannister pickets. The knowledge of the land from her youth allowed her to reach a hidden postern gate along Riverrun's outer defenses, where Tully guards recognized her. She was admitted into the fortress under cover of darkness, the hush of the night broken by the calls of sentries and the occasional arrow loosed from the walls. She found her brother Edmure in the Great Hall, conferring with Ser Brynden Tully, the Blackfish. Edmure's relief at seeing her was palpable, and he embraced her, though weariness clung to him like a shroud. Brynden also embraced her warmly but quickly asked about the size of Robb's forces. The men in the hall wore drawn faces. They had been under siege for weeks, and though Riverrun's defenses remained formidable, the knowledge that the Lannisters waited outside with the threat of reinforcements weighed heavily on them. Catelyn outlined Robb's plan. Edmure, despite his frustration from being cooped up, nodded agreement. "It's bold," he admitted, pacing across the rush-covered floor. "Perhaps that is exactly what we need." Brynden studied her with a wry smile. "You always were the more cunning one in our family, Cat. May the gods see this through." With the plan secured, she took her leave. At dawn, as agreed, the castle defenders would make a demonstration against the southern walls. Meanwhile, Robb's smaller unit would skirt around to the west, allowing the Lannisters to see them and hopefully engage. Then the hidden cavalry would strike from the east. It was a delicate dance of illusions. By the time she rejoined Robb, the horizon paled with early light. The Grachan's men were already in motion to form the decoy lines. Carefully, quietly, Robb's main strength lay in the wooded rise near the river. Catelyn remained behind with the main group, from where she could witness the strategy play out. Morning broke in full, gilding the world in a pale, hopeful light. Horns sounded from the Lannister camp, and the watchers from Riverrun's walls spotted movement. Edmure's men let the portcullis rise just enough to let out a small mounted party. They swept across the field, brandishing spears and Tully banners. From the distance, Jaime Lannister's host began to stir, mustering to repel the sally. Meanwhile, on the western flank, the Great John and a select force of northern men emerged. They beat shields, raised war cries, and taunted the Lannisters. From her vantage, Catelyn saw the glint of their armor in the bright sun, the swirl of dust under the hooves of their horses. Jaime, arrogant and confident in his prowess, would not let such a threat linger. He shifted a significant portion of his cavalry to meet this new foe, pulling them away from the main siege lines. In that crucial moment, as the Lannister lines thinned near the forest, Robb gave the signal. The main body of northern cavalry burst forth from the treeline, the thunder of hooves rolling like a storm. The Lannister outriders reeled, and the entire western flank of Jaime's formation began to collapse in confusion, caught between the Grachan's decoy and Robb's charge. Catelyn watched it unfold with a mixture of trepidation and pride. The trap was sprung. Grey wind ran at Robb's side, a silver flash darting among the chaos. Trumpets blared, men shouted in dismay, and then the wave of the north crashed into the unsuspecting Lannisters. She saw the swirl of banners, the dire wolf of Stark, the sunburst of Karstark, the roaring bear of Mormont, and the lion of Lannister, bright gold and crimson, was rent by sword and spear in the whirling melee. Jaime himself rode to stave off the rout. She could see that much. His gilded armor gleamed, and he fought with the skill for which he was infamous, felling northern men who came too close. But with so many of his men pinned between Riverrun's small sally and the powerful northern cavalry, there was little he could do to rally them all. Brynden Tully and Edmure took the opportunity to lead a second wave from the castle gates, smashing into the Lannister flank. The siege lines folded, and the proud lion's standard faltered. Within hours, the siege was broken, and Riverrun's gates stood open. Lannister forces that could still flee fled in scattered groups, pursued by outriders. Jaime himself, separated from the bulk of his men, found himself encircled by Karstark knights, though he managed to fight free at first. Yet in the chaos, he could not rejoin his main host. Robb saw the opportunity and rode to meet him. The Kingslayer faced the young wolf in a brief, furious clash. Catelyn, from her distant vantage point, held her breath. The roar of hooves and the clash of steel echoed across the field. Grey wind lunged at Jaime's steed, forcing the animal to rear back. Jaime, forced off balance, was unhorsed, and the northern men closed in, subduing him at last. When the dust settled, Catelyn emerged to walk the battlefield. Her heart ached at the sight of the dead and wounded, men from both sides lying amid trampled earth. The crows were already gathering. Yet for all the horror, victory for the North was undeniable. Riverrun was freed, her brother and uncle were safe, and the man who had pushed Bran from the tower, Jaime Lannister, was now in chains. This single triumph would echo through the Riverlands and beyond. Robb, splattered with mud and streaks of blood, dismounted near her. He removed his helm, letting his copper-brown curls tumble free. His face was grim and victorious in equal measure, and behind him the men cheered the young wolf. She went to him, pressing a hand to his cheek. She could feel the subtle quiver of adrenaline in his jaw, the rush of having led men into battle. "You did it," she said softly. He nodded, voice weary. "We did it. Mother, without your counsel, I might have charged blindly into their lines. We could have lost half our men." She pulled him into an embrace, ignoring the blood on his armor. He was alive and triumphant, and though sorrow hung over them at the thought of Ned's fate, she sensed that everything had changed. This was no longer a simple rebellion. Robb Stark, the young wolf, had outmaneuvered Jaime Lannister, and the realm would know it. They entered Riverrun to a hero's welcome. Edmure clasped Robb's hand with tears in his eyes, praising him before the garrison. The Blackfish, aloof and sharp-witted, regarded Robb with new respect. As for Jaime Lannister, he was thrown into one of Riverrun's deep cells under heavy guard. That night, the Northern Lords gathered in the Great Hall to celebrate. Ale flowed, though the mood was tempered by the knowledge that the war was far from over. Yet for one evening, victory was sweet. Catelyn watched her son from across the hall as men hailed him as the king in the north. He sat at the high table listening to Rickard Karstark, the Great John, and the others discuss their next moves. She saw the seriousness in Robb, his willingness to hear counsel, and she also saw the admiration in their eyes. Already they believed in him. They were not yet chanting for him to wear a crown, but the talk of a northern king could be felt in the air. The notion had gathered momentum after Ned's capture. The men wanted a sovereign free of southern entanglements. They wanted to avenge the insult done to the Stark name. Catelyn let them talk, carefully steering the conversation when possible, for she knew that if Robb were to claim the title of king, they had to approach it at precisely the right time. A poorly timed claim would bring every power in Westeros down upon them before they were ready. For now, she counseled him on practical matters: gathering food, negotiating alliances with the River Lords, ensuring that the men remained disciplined. She recalled how her father, Hoster Tully, had forged alliances in the past. Now, with the presence of an army larger than many had seen in a generation, the local lords were more than ready to swear fealty to the cause. They had witnessed the cruelty of Tywin Lannister's foraging parties. They wanted justice, yet justice alone did not end wars. Over the next few days, Catelyn took a leading hand in forging letters to the Lords of the Trident, emphasizing that the North came as allies, not conquerors. In truth, she wrote, they had come to free the Riverlands from the Lannisters' aggression. She worded each message carefully, appealing to old relationships, citing the Tully name and the bonds once shared. Her father was old, near death, but his memory commanded respect. Brynden assured that ravens bearing these letters took wing to the various keeps of the Riverlands. Meanwhile, Robb held war councils where each lord could speak. He listened, asked questions, and made decisions after careful deliberation with Catelyn and his council. The Great John wanted to march immediately upon Harrenhal, to wrest it from Tywin's forces. Roose Bolton suggested they entrench themselves near the Red Fork to cut off any approach from the south. Edmure argued for sweeping west to wrest control of the gold-rich lands around the Lannister seat itself. Each plan had merit, each had dangers. Robb absorbed them all, but before deciding, he turned to his mother. She did not relish the public nature of his request. Yet she knew that if they were to maintain a united front, Robb must show that he valued her counsel without seeming to cede power. "My son," she said, letting her gaze encompass all the lords, "I humbly suggest that we first secure the Riverlands, ensuring no Lannister force remains behind us. Then we can move west to claim the advantage before Tywin can regroup. Tywin is cunning. If we leave him an avenue behind us, he will exploit it. The lords, especially those from the north, murmured in agreement. Ricard Karstark spoke up. Lady Catelyn speaks truth. Best to secure our rear before we march deeper into Lion territory. Robb nodded. That is what we shall do then. We will pacify the Riverlands and gather additional support. I want outriders patrolling the roads. If Tywin himself moves north from the Blackwater or sends more men under Gregor Clegane, we must know at once. Thus decided, the northern host set about cleansing the Riverlands of Lannister holdfasts. The war was not a series of grand battles alone, but smaller engagements, sieges, and negotiations. Catelyn accompanied Robb for much of this campaign, advising him on which local lords might be swayed, which minor lords had grudges that could be exploited. The knowledge she had from her Tully upbringing served them well. Castle by castle, they liberated or negotiated, sometimes forcing out Lannister garrisons, sometimes accepting surrender. Robb was firm but never needlessly cruel, and Catelyn saw how that earned him loyalty. Many river lords came willingly under his banner, and with each success, the North grew in renown. From the captive Jaime Lannister, they gleaned only barbed remarks. He was kept under guard, a reminder of their victory, but Catelyn warned Robb to treat him carefully. He's cunning, a man of pride. If we humiliate him, it may breed further enmity. Better to keep him alive and secure. Someday, he might be the only leverage we have to secure the safety of your sisters. The mention of her daughters made her voice waver. She still grieved for Ned, but her maternal instinct told her that Sansa and Arya might yet be used as pawns in King's Landing. If they had Jaime, perhaps they could exchange him for the girls. Robb listened. Jaime was placed under guard with Bolton's men, who watched him with a quiet intensity. Catelyn was never entirely comfortable with Roose Bolton, but he had so far proven loyal. Even so, she kept a watchful eye on how he handled their famed prisoner. Months passed in this manner, a steady consolidation of territory. Word reached them that Joffrey had claimed the Iron Throne, that Ned Stark was indeed dead, executed on Joffrey's whim. The tragedy hung over them, but it also hardened the men's resolve. In the aftermath, many of the northern lords began to openly call Robb Stark king in the north, outraged at the brutality and injustice. In an assembly near the banks of the Trident, beneath a weirwood that grew twisted and gnarled by centuries, the great Jon boomed out, "He's the king in the north, we will have no other. Let the south have their boy king of incest. We are the free north." Catelyn stood beside Robb at that moment. The lords, one after another, knelt. It was a stirring sight, though filled with sorrow. They knelt in part to honor Ned's memory and to defy the Lannisters, but also to commit to a new destiny. She saw the weight of it settle on Robb's shoulders. He pledged to protect the North, to avenge the wrongs done, and to bring home his sisters if they still lived. He also spoke of an alliance with the Riverlands, forging them as a bulwark against the South. The men cheered, raising their swords in salute. That evening, in the relative quiet of their makeshift command tent, she found him with his face in his hands. "I never wanted a crown," he whispered. "I wanted to save father, to protect my family. Now I'm a king." She laid a gentle hand on his head, running her fingers through his hair. "You are, and men believe in you. That is a weapon, but also a chain. You must use it wisely. Power can destroy those who wield it rashly. Let me help guide you, if you will have my counsel." He raised his eyes to hers. "I will always want your counsel." They embraced, tears slipping free for all that had been lost. The next morning, King Robb Stark rose resolute, continuing the campaign to secure the Riverlands. Messages came from the lords who had once owed fealty to Riverrun. Many pledged their arms to Robb, swelling his ranks. Some wavered, uncertain whether Tywin might strike back with a vengeance. Catelyn urged Robb to send calm, measured words of reassurance. "Use the carrot before the stick," she said. "That way, if we must use the stick, it will be with a clear conscience and a resolute hand." He heeded her. As a result, more local lords joined than resisted. In the small battles that did erupt, Robb's forces, guided by cunning feints and superior cavalry, overwhelmed Lannister garrisons. Tywin Lannister, ironically, was busy contending with Stannis Baratheon and other threats that flared in the south, which gave Robb time to strengthen the North Riverlands alliance. He began to station loyal men in key fortresses. They marched through the chilly rains of autumn, braving muddy roads, forging a new shape for their war. Catelyn, though weary in body, kept her mind sharp, overseeing the logistic flow. Food, arms, coin, these were the real currency of a conqueror's campaign. Swords alone would not sustain them. In time, rumors reached them of Renly Baratheon and Stannis Baratheon both claiming the throne. The War of the Five Kings, people whispered. Yet among those swirling claims, the name that was growing in the north and along the Trident was Robb Stark, king in the north. The small folk, oppressed by Lannister outriders, began to revere him as a savior. Catelyn recognized that as an asset. Hearts and minds could mean the difference between an army fed by grateful towns or an army turned away with empty hands. When winter's chill grew deeper, the campaign slowed. They made winter camps near fortresses that had large enough storehouses. Riverrun itself provided a central base. Lord Walder Frey, through gritted teeth, had to acquiesce to further demands for safe passage along the Green Fork. Robb had by now grown more cautious in dealing with the Freys, mindful of their ever-shifting loyalties. But for the time being, the alliance held. Walder Frey had not pressed him to fulfill the marriage contract yet, likely waiting for more favorable terms. Catelyn saw that as a problem deferred, not solved, and she reminded Robb frequently, "Lord Walder will have his due. We must be prepared." In those quiet winter evenings at Riverrun, Robb presided over councils with an ease that belied his age. The lords, once inclined to test him, came to accept not just his rightful claim but also his strategic acumen. They teased him that Grey Wind was the real mastermind, though in truth, they knew. Behind Robb's cool planning was also the counsel of a woman well-versed in southern intrigues. The dynamic mother-son leadership was unorthodox in some eyes, but it worked. Catelyn also pressed Robb to remember the hostages in King's Landing. "Sansa and Arya," she would say, voice thick with emotion. "We have the Kingslayer, but as yet I do not see Joffrey or Cersei offering any exchange. They hold our girls for the day they can force our hand." Robb frowned at that. "If we besiege them, if we threaten to starve them out, perhaps they will yield the girls. But attacking King's Landing directly is madness with the Red Keep so secure and the other Baratheons in motion. Perhaps we can find a different means," Catelyn suggested. "A secret negotiation or perhaps a synergy with Stannis or Renly. If one of them topples the Lannisters in King's Landing, we can negotiate with whoever takes the throne. Our concern is the North, not the Iron Throne itself." So began a series of clandestine correspondences. While the war raged elsewhere, Robb and Catelyn reached out to both Baratheon claimants, testing the waters for an alliance. Catelyn penned the letters carefully, appealing to the injustice done to Ned, proposing that if the North were recognized as an independent kingdom, they would remain neutral in the conflict for the Iron Throne. In return, they wanted peace with the new king and the safe return of Sansa and Arya Stark. She also implied that they held Jaime Lannister, whose life was a valuable chip. They received no immediate answer from Stannis, though rumors said he was a hard man, less likely to compromise. Renly, flamboyant and well-liked, replied with a courteous note, praising Ned Stark's honor and offering ambiguous promises of future cooperation. Yet it was clear that Renly wanted the North's direct support if he hoped to unseat Joffrey. He was not prepared to grant total independence to the North and the Riverlands as a first step, so the negotiations remained at an impasse. Meanwhile, Tywin Lannister had not been idle. Word came of a large force assembling near Harrenhal under his command. The men in Robb's war council grew uneasy. They had planned meticulously, but if Tywin marched north with enough men, he could potentially break through their lines. That was when Catelyn suggested another approach, distraction. She recalled how the Tullus had aided Robert Baratheon in the rebellion by striking at strategic times, forcing the Crown's forces to split their attentions. If Tywin must fight on two fronts, he will be less able to overwhelm us. Roose Bolton's voice came softly from the corner. "Perhaps we can sow rumors of an uprising in the Westerlands themselves. or sabotage the gold mines. Tywin's men rely heavily on the wealth of that region. Robb looked intrigued. We could dispatch small teams of skilled riders, men who know how to blend into the countryside. They could disrupt Tywin's supply lines. If the peasants are stirred against the Lannisters, Catelyn raised a hand. Careful not to stir them so violently they fear for their lives under us. We want them to question Tywin's capacity to protect them, not to hate our name. We are not the mountain who rides, burning villages for sport. Robb nodded. A measured approach then. Bolton, gather men who can operate discreetly. Hit their supply wagons, harass their outriders, but don't slaughter small folk unnecessarily. We want them to doubt their lord, not avenge him. In this way, Robb and Catelyn orchestrated a series of strategic disruptions behind enemy lines. It worked well enough that Tywin was forced to leave a portion of his army in the Westerlands to maintain control. Another portion was sent to hold Harrenhal. The Lannisters could not field their full might in a single wave, which suited Robb just fine. Yet as winter's icy grip tightened, the war slowed to a grueling crawl. Scouts whispered of Sellswords flocking to Tywin's banner, of alliances forming in the far south with House Tyrell. The Baratheon brothers threatened King's Landing, and the city reportedly seethed with unrest. The War of the Five Kings ground on, each faction vying for advantage. Between the lines, small folk starved or fled. Catelyn felt the weight of it each time she saw refugees on the roads, ragged and terrified. The cost of war was not measured only in crowns and claims, but in broken families. Through it all, she stayed close to her son, guiding him. She had him make a pointed show of generosity to the displaced in the Riverlands, distributing bread and minimal coin from Riverrun stores. Edmure cautioned that they couldn't feed everyone without risking famine in the fortress. Yet the gesture endeared Robb to many who spread tales of the just young king who cared for them. In a conflict decided as much by hearts as by swords, it was a subtle victory. In the bleakest months, when the snow piled high and roads became perilous, they settled in for a winter encampment near Riverrun. Catelyn took the opportunity to speak privately with her son about the next steps. Come spring, Tywin will strike. We cannot remain on the defensive forever. Robb paced the Solar. I want to take the fight to the Westerlands. If we strike at Casterly Rock or near enough, we force Tywin to protect his seat. He can't simply ravage the Riverlands at will if his own land is in danger. She nodded thoughtfully. But that means crossing the hills and approaches that are well guarded by the Lannisters. We will need more allies or a cunning approach. Perhaps the coastline. He paused, considering. A naval approach would require ships, which we lack. Unless we gain the support of the Ironborn, but they are no friends of ours. She frowned. The Ironborn are more likely to raid us than assist us. Balon Greyjoy would see this war as an opportunity to carve out his own dominion. No, the sea is too uncertain. We may have to go through the mountains or attempt infiltration. They spoke late into the night, weighing options. Catelyn felt a strange satisfaction in this partnership, her guidance fueling Robb's strategic mind. He was quick, learning day by day. She saw him sometimes lose himself in the swirl of tactics, forgetting the heartbreak that had set them on this path. Yet she was always there to remind him of their ultimate purpose: to secure the North, to protect their people, and to free his sisters if they lived. At last the snows began to melt, the days lengthening into a reluctant spring. Scouts returned with unsettling news. Tywin had regrouped, forging alliances with certain houses in the Crownlands, amassing an army that dwarfed the one Robb had faced before. He intended to smash the North's foothold in the Riverlands and push forward to take vengeance for Jaime's capture. The scale of the threat made some of Robb's lords quake. Yet the young wolf did not waver. He had a plan, an audacious thrust westward, deeper into Lannister territory, away from Tywin's massive host. In council, men questioned him. If we march west, we leave the Riverlands open to Tywin's horde, Edmure Tully pointed out. Robb nodded but explained, if we remain here, we meet him in open battle. They outnumber us. We might win if we repeat our successes, but the cost in lives would be enormous, and that assumes Tywin makes a mistake. Better to force him to come after us on ground we choose. The farther west we go, the more he must extend his supply lines, and we can use the terrain to our advantage. Also, the Westerlands hold his gold mines. He will not sit idle while we plunder them. He'll come, and we can pick our battlefield carefully." There was an uneasy silence. Then Catelyn rose. "You have all witnessed how my son has led us from victory to victory. The Lannisters would destroy us if we let them. By taking the fight to them, we turn the tables. Let us trust in King Robb's strategy." She had used the title deliberately, reminding them of the vows they had made. One by one, the lords bowed their heads in agreement. The Great John roared his approval, always eager for bold action. Bolton said nothing but dipped his head. Catelyn did not trust that silence entirely, yet so far, Bolton had proven dutiful. And so, in a series of forced marches, the northern host crossed the rough terrain that separated the Riverlands from the Westerlands. Their outriders scouted rocky passes, their main force trudging carefully along narrow roads. Harsh weather still dogged them, but morale was high. The men sang songs of the young wolf, who had yet to lose a major battle. Catelyn traveled often at Robb's side, though sometimes she rode with the baggage train or the supply wagons, helping keep order. She became a familiar figure among the soldiers, the Lady of Winterfell who planned strategies with her son. They dubbed her the Mother of Victory in jest, and she only smiled. If it kept them hopeful, so be it. As they descended into the Westerlands proper, they saw the difference at once. This was Lannister land, richer farmland, imposing keeps. Robb's plan was not to wage a campaign of terror, but to strike selected targets of strategic worth. Iron mines, key roads, small Lannister garrisons. He avoided pitched battles whenever possible, deploying swift cavalry raids to seize or destroy enemy supplies. In effect, he forced Tywin to split his forces further, chasing shadows. Catelyn marveled at how adept Robb had grown at this style of warfare. Cunning, flexible, and relying on a network of scouts and spies that let him see the Lannisters' movements before they struck. Yet it was not all skirmishes. Outside the fortress of Ashmark, they faced a formidable Lannister garrison. Robb feigned an attack on the main gate, then circled a hidden pass, breaching the rear walls at night. The fortress fell with minimal bloodshed, its defenders taken by surprise. Robb allowed them to surrender, treating prisoners with decency. Word spread of his fairness, and a few more Lannister-held castles sent envoys offering terms rather than face open siege. In this way, the young wolf sliced deeper into Tywin's domain than any foe had in living memory. Wealthy mines near Castamere were seized, though many had been long emptied or collapsed. The name Castamere itself conjured the memory of House Rhaen's destruction at Tywin's hands, an example of Lannister ruthlessness. Now, ironically, it was the Starks who walked these halls. Catelyn felt the ghosts of old grudges whispering in the stones. Inevitably, Tywin responded. His outriders harassed Robb's lines. Larger Lannister hosts approached from the south, seeking to box the young wolf in. But Robb's infiltration had progressed so far that Tywin could not ignore it without losing face and coin alike. He marched in person, commanding a force that dwarfed Robb's in number. The confrontation was coming. The only question was, where? Robb selected a wide valley near the foothills of the mountains. It was peppered with streams and rocky outcroppings, a place where a larger force would struggle to maneuver effectively. He arranged lines of sharpened stakes, concealed by brush. He posted archers on the high ground. He used ravens to coordinate with smaller detachments placed at the valley's edges. It was a tapestry of defenses that would funnel Tywin's men into a killing field if they came at him directly. Catelyn stood with Robb on a hill overlooking the valley as they waited for news of Tywin's approach. The sky was gray, wind whipping at the Stark banners. Gray wind lay at Robb's feet, ears perked. She touched her son's shoulder. "You have done all you can. May the gods see us safely through." He squeezed her hand. "If we fail, I have led them all to their doom. If we succeed, we break Tywin Lannister's power in his own land." He exhaled. "Pray for us, Mother." She silently did so, thinking of the gods wood in Winterfell and the old prayers Ned might have spoken. Let the old gods and the new watch over them. The word came at dusk. Tywin was just a few leagues away, advancing in columns. The tension in the northern ranks grew. Fires were banked to hide their numbers. Scattered illusions, such as decoy campfires, were placed in the valley to mislead the Lannisters into the trap's center. Catelyn found herself once again waiting, as she had done during the siege of Riverrun, her heart pounding with dread and anticipation. In the dim twilight, Tywin's vanguard appeared, scouting the valley. From her vantage, Catelyn saw the torches flicker as horsemen tested the ground. They found the decoy camp, no doubt reporting back that the Stark forces were there, seemingly small in number. Tywin pressed forward, wanting to crush Robb at last. His center advanced, thousands upon thousands of men streaming into the valley. Catelyn's breath caught at the sheer scale. Even with all Robb's cunning, if Tywin discovered the trap too soon, the weight of numbers could still overwhelm them. But Robb waited until Tywin's leading edge was well inside the ring of stakes and concealed pits. At his signal, horns blew from the surrounding hills. Arrows rained down, sending Lannister ranks into disarray. The stakes and pits tore apart cavalry charges. Meanwhile, small groups of northern infantry emerged from hidden gullies to strike at the flanks. War cries echoed off the rocks. Under the barrage of arrows and the confusion of the terrain, Tywin's men struggled to form coherent battle lines. Catelyn watched Robb direct the archers. He signaled them to shift aim whenever the Lannisters massed for a push. He had leaders stationed at intervals, each well informed of the plan, each ready to adapt if needed. It was a masterpiece of coordination compared to older, more rigid tactics. The Lannisters, for their part, were not helpless. Tywin's men were disciplined, and they fought fiercely, pushing into the valley. But they encountered wave after wave of carefully laid obstacles and sudden attacks from the hillsides. At the height of the battle, Tywin himself appeared in the fray, a hard-faced figure in gilded armor, shouting for order. He began to rally his men for a decisive push up the slope. If they could break the northern lines in one place, they might escape the trap and sweep around. Robb anticipated this. He let Tywin see a gap near the southwestern ridge, a line that seemed thinly held by a smaller contingent of Stark men. Tywin's knights charged toward it, hoping to break free. But that gap was a feint. As soon as the Lannisters committed, hidden reserves under the Greatjon rushed in, driving them into another ring of stakes. Chaos erupted again. Still, the carnage was great. Men screamed, horses fell. The clash of steel and the roar of dying filled the air. Catelyn clenched her fists, silently praying for Robb's life. She saw glimpses of gray wind lunging at Lannister knights who broke through. She heard the Greatjon's mighty war cries echo in the gloom. The acrid smell of blood and smoke drifted on the wind. By midnight, the Lannister center had been battered mercilessly. Tywin managed to extract a portion of his men to retreat, but not before suffering a grievous defeat. Much of his force had broken or surrendered. The valley was strewn with red and gold banners torn and trampled. The northern forces were bloodied too, though not shattered. Robb's cunning battlefield plan had worked again, turning Tywin's overwhelming numbers against him by forcing them into a lethal bottleneck. When the horns sounded the end of combat, Catelyn descended the hill, flanked by guards. She found Robb dismounted in the valley, leaning on his sword. He was smeared with blood and grime, breath ragged. Gray wind stayed close, muzzle dark with gore. The men around Robb still looked dazed from the ferocity of the fight. Bodies lay everywhere, some moaning, some silent. It was a dreadful sight, but amid it, Robb's battered host still stood. She came to him, clasping his arms. "My son, you are alive." Tears of relief welled in her eyes. He nodded, exhausted. Tywin fled south with what remains of his guard, but we have shattered his host. Gods, so many dead. He looked around, haunted. Every victory tastes of ash. Catelyn understood that feeling. War was monstrous, yet she also felt the magnitude of the achievement. You have broken Tywin's power here. He cannot quickly muster another army. This might be our chance to force a peace that frees your sisters and acknowledges your rule." Robb sank onto a fallen log, trembling from the aftermath. "We must try. The men are calling it a great victory, but how long until the next battle?" He swallowed. "Still, if we press our advantage, we may see an end. A real end." In the aftermath, Robb ordered the care of the wounded, both Northern and Lannister. Catelyn saw to it that the prisoners were treated with a harsh but not cruel hand. They buried the dead with what decency they could. Rumors spread across the land like wildfire. Tywin Lannister's might had been broken in a night by the young wolf and his mother's cunning. The reigns of Castamere had once been a cautionary tale about crossing House Lannister. Now men told stories of another caution, crossing House Stark under the leadership of Robb and Lady Catelyn. Tywin himself was not captured, but the damage to his prestige was done. Cersei and Joffrey in King's Landing surely quaked at the news. Catelyn wrote letters again, urging them to trade Sansa and Arya for Jaime Lannister, offering a truce, an end to hostilities if the North was granted its independence. She stressed that continuing this war would only lead to further ruin. Behind the scenes, she and Robb planned for every contingency. If the Lannisters refused, they would press forward. But there was hope that, finally, reason might prevail. With Tywin's main force shattered, the throne was threatened by the Baratheons and Tyrells. Holding the North and the Riverlands by force would be nearly impossible for the Lannisters now. They waited for a reply, days turning into weeks. Scouts brought more rumors. Stannis besieging King's Landing, or perhaps Renly rallying in the Reach. Some said the Tyrells had shifted alliances. The realm was in flux, the power structures fracturing. Catelyn sensed that if the Lannisters were wise, they would cut their losses and strike a deal with the North. At last a raven came. The seal of the Queen Regent was on the parchment. In her letter, Cersei wrote that the crown was amenable to discussions for the release of Sansa Stark in exchange for Jaime Lannister. Only Sansa was mentioned, not Arya, and there was no promise of northern independence. Catelyn's heart pounded with anger at the omission of her younger daughter. She read it to Robb, who frowned. One daughter is not enough, and no mention of freeing the North from the Iron Throne's claim, he said coldly. Catelyn penned a reply. Jaime Lannister would remain a hostage until both Stark girls were returned, and until the crown recognized the North's sovereignty. She also demanded that the Riverlands remain allied with the North, forming a separate kingdom from the Crownlands. It was an enormous ask, but from a position of strength, there was no point in half measures. Robb signed it, his name and title spelled out in bold strokes. Robb Stark, King in the North, Lord of Winterfell and Protector of the Riverlands. The war was not over, not yet. More battles might loom if the crown refused. But in the foothills of the Westerlands, amid the hush that followed the carnage, Catelyn and Robb awaited a moment of truth. She stood by him, calm and resolute, heart aching for her girls, for Ned, for all that had been lost. Yet a glimmer of hope shone. Robb had proven himself more than just a wolf of the North. He was a cunning conqueror, guided by the steady hand of his mother's counsel. The realm could not ignore him. In the shifting tides of the war, the Stark name had become a beacon or a terror depending on where one stood. As they made ready for the next steps, negotiations or battles, Catelyn reflected on the journey that had brought them here. She thought of Ned, of his quiet honor. She thought of the savage blow of losing him and the illusions of safety that had once cloaked Winterfell. She thought of her son, once a boy, now a king, one who wore a crown of ice and steel, tempered by cunning gleaned from her years of navigating southern courts. Where once she had dreaded the Game of Thrones, she now played it for the sake of her children. If it kept her girls safe, if it preserved the North, she would play it to the bitter end. Standing on a ridge, she gazed out over the battered Lannister encampments below, the flicker of torches casting shadows on crimson tents. The wind tugged at her hair. Robb came up beside her, expression solemn. "Will they yield?" he asked softly. She let out a breath. "They must, if they have any sense." Then she turned to him. "If they do, we will have our independence and your sisters. If they don't, we will fight again. But this time, my son, the realm knows we cannot be taken lightly. She placed a hand on his arm. Keep your wits about you. The greatest challenges can arise when victory seems near. Promises may be broken, alliances undone. A cornered lion can lash out. He nodded. I will be ready, mother. A faint smile touched his lips. And I will listen. They stood together, mother and son, at the threshold of a new dawn. The long night had been stained with blood, but the morning might bring the North its freedom. No matter what came, Catelyn Stark would guide Robb, and Robb would lead their people with both the steel in his hand and the cunning in his mind. And under their banner, the dire wolf of Stark stood proud, howling its challenge to all the false crowns in the realm. They called it the Hour of the Wolf, that silent, tremulous span before the sun crested the eastern horizon, when the world lay hushed and cold, caught between the dying night and the newborn morning. In the foothills of the Westerlands, near a valley strewn with the aftermath of brutal battle, Catelyn Stark felt the chill seep through her cloak. She stood beside her son Robb, no longer simply the young wolf, now very much a king in more than name, and regarded him in the faint gray light. He rested one hand on Grey Wind's massive head, his knuckles blood-raw from long hours of fighting and leading men. They had broken Tywin Lannister's host on this very ground, an achievement that stunned half the realm. But as she had reminded Robb often, sometimes the greatest dangers arose in victory's wake. Tywin had fled with a fraction of his men, and the Starks and Tullis now held more prisoners than they could easily feed. Chief among them was no longer Jaime Lannister, already captive in the Riverlands, but a handful of lesser Lannisters, cousins and sworn swords, proud in defeat. The cracks in House Lannister's power were apparent, but a cornered lion had teeth yet, and she knew Tywin well enough to suspect he would strike back, or else regroup in some cunning way. On the wide canvas of the War of the Five Kings, a single great victory did not guarantee peace. It only opened more perilous doors. Catelyn tightened her cloak about her shoulders. Her breath hovered as a pale cloud before her lips. As the new morning light strengthened, she saw, for the first time with clarity, just how grim the valley looked. Torn banners of crimson and gold littered the muddy earth. Broken spears, upended shields, and the bodies of men and horses lay stiff with frost. Northern soldiers were already sifting through the wreckage, dragging aside the dead to be buried, tending the wounded who had survived the night. The smell of wood smoke and blood lingered, and the crows circled, cawing in eager hunger. Robb exhaled, the faintest tremor slipping free, though his voice was steady. We'll soon need to move. The men have done what they can in the dark, but we cannot tarry. Tywin will have riders out in every direction. She nodded. Where do we go next? He glanced down at Grey Wind, who let out a low rumble. First, we consolidate. We see to our wounded, gather prisoners, and arrange supply lines. Then, to press farther south and west if possible, toward Lannisport. By all accounts, the city is half in panic, half in denial. If we threaten the coast, Tywin will be forced to race back again or risk losing his seat of power. Catelyn had spent much of the night considering that plan. We must be cautious not to overextend. We still have enemies behind us, lords in the Westerlands who've not yet bent the knee. We can't garrison every holdfast, and the Riverlands are still rebuilding. If we march on Lannisport too soon, we risk exposing our supply lines. Robb's jaw tightened. True enough. Yet if we remain here, we gain little. Tywin might regroup, or else sail around from the south. And we must keep up the pressure on him for the sake of your daughters. Joffrey and Cersei will not negotiate in good faith unless they fear losing everything. She hesitated at the mention of Sansa and Arya, then placed a hand on his forearm. I only ask that we avoid impulsive moves. You've won your battles with cunning and foresight, not by reckless charges. Let that guide you still. His eyes flicked over her face. Mother, I swear that I will not gamble our men's lives on a whim. We have come this far together. I won't discard your counsel. She gave him a faint smile, warmth stirring in her chest despite the icy air. That is all I ask. They began walking together along the edge of the battlefield, Grey Wind loping ahead with an occasional pause to scent the wind. Men rose stiffly from bedrolls by the ashes of nighttime fires to bow as Robb passed. Most wore the sigils of the North: Mormont's bear, Karstark's sunburst, Bolton's flayed man, Glover's mailed fist. But here and there she caught glimpses of Riverlord's devices, newly arrived or newly sworn: the black fish of Tully, the red horse of Bracken, the blue and red quartered disc of Vance. Even knights of House Westerling and House Oscary, small western houses bitter with the Lannisters, had joined Robb after hearing of Tywin's defeat. Word traveled fast. The young wolf was not just any upstart. He was unstoppable. Or so the songs claimed. Catelyn knew better. War was rarely so straightforward. They needed each alliance carefully kept, or their entire structure might totter. They paused by a row of wounded men laid out on stretched cloaks. The northern maesters bustled to and fro, checking wounds, administering milk of the poppy. When Robb knelt beside one young soldier whose left arm was bandaged to the shoulder, the man mustered a pained smile and attempted to rise. Robb bade him lie still. "Rest. You fought bravely," he said quietly. "We'll see to your healing." Catelyn noted the soldier's gauntlet lying nearby, the leather stiff with dried blood. The fellow couldn't have been older than 16, just a year younger than Robb, she realized, though her son had seen more of war's horrors than most men thrice his age. A fresh wave of sorrow and anger welled within her. She remembered how things had been before Ned was taken. Now, every day was a battle between the unstoppable momentum of war and her desperate desire to protect what remained of her family. She walked with Robb further along the lines. A detachment of soldiers approached, leading a handful of new prisoners taken at dawn, Lannister outriders most likely. They stumbled forward, hands bound, wearing battered breastplates bearing the golden lion. Their breath plumed in the cold air. One had a fresh slash across his cheek, the blood congealed black in the crisp morning. A northern captain saluted. "Your Grace, these were scouting our perimeter. They surrendered rather than resist." Robb regarded the prisoners calmly. "They'll be placed under guard with the others. Make sure they're fed. We gain nothing by starving them." The captain bowed, and the prisoners were led away. Catelyn could see suspicion in the men's eyes. Perhaps they expected to be executed. The rumors of the mountain's savage raids in the Riverlands had left many in the north full of vengeance. But Robb was not Gregor Clegane. She had raised him better, and he had chosen his own path of restraint. The realm took note. Indeed, some said the difference between the wolves and the lions lay in how they treated the vanquished. Eventually, they made their way to the command tent, set on a small rise that overlooked the valley. Inside, the air was warmer, scented with stew and bread. A large table had been set up with a rough map of the Westerlands. Lords and captains were gathered, voices subdued, eyes ringed with weariness. Among them stood Great John Umber, towering even in exhaustion, and Roose Bolton, pale-faced and quiet. Edmure Tully had remained back in the Riverlands, tending to Riverrun's defenses, so his place was taken by Ser Brynden Tully, the Blackfish. The older knight inclined his head to Catelyn as she entered. They briefly took their seats. Robb straightened his spine, and though he was still streaked with dirt and dried blood, he radiated command. Catelyn saw the others eye him with respect and a hint of awe. This was the boy. No, the young man who had beaten Jaime Lannister, who had shattered Tywin's forces, who was rumored to have cunning far beyond his years. They did not glance at her often, but Catelyn knew that many recognized her quiet influence on the young wolf. Robb spoke without preamble. "We've won a great victory, but that alone won't end the war. Tywin Lannister has retreated, and we don't know if he rides for King's Landing or for Harrenhal, or if he means to gather fresh levies deeper in the Westerlands. Either way, our advantage is that the realm sees the Lannisters can be beaten. The question is how to press that advantage while safeguarding the North and the Riverlands." The Great John rumbled. "We should smash on toward Casterly Rock and Lannisport. Let the lions cower in their dens as we knock down their gates." Roose Bolton, hands folded inside the sleeves of his dark robes, replied in a mild tone. "That is one approach, but it might leave us surrounded by a land still loyal to the Lannisters, with Tywin regrouping behind us. We could find ourselves in a vice." Brynden Tully spoke next, flicking his gaze between them. If Tywin is wise, he won't attempt another field battle so soon. He's lost too many men. He'll fortify the critical strongholds and wait for the rest of the realm to handle us. King's Landing is under threat from Stannis Baratheon by some accounts and Renly Baratheon in the Reach. Tywin might even strike a pact with the Tyrells if it helps him maintain control. Catelyn saw Robb's expression darken. I have no doubt he'll try. We can't rely on the Lannisters being friendless. The Tyrells hold great power, and if they join with the crown, we'll face an alliance that could muster more men than we can match. The Great John bristled. Are we to cower here because of rumors? We have the advantage now. Press it. Take the fight to their doorstep. Catelyn cleared her throat softly, drawing their attention. Robb gave a subtle nod, wordlessly inviting her to speak. We must be certain of our lines of supply. Our men are already weary. Many bear wounds. If we hurl ourselves at Lannisport only to be trapped or starved out, all our previous victories could unravel. Our best path might be more subtle. Robb has used feints and cunning to outmaneuver the Lannisters so far. Why abandon that for a reckless siege? She paused, letting the gathered lords weigh her words. That said, a direct threat on Lannisport could still serve us if done carefully. We must give Tywin reason to fear losing the wealth of House Lannister. And at the same time, we should see if the crown is finally willing to talk peace now that Tywin has been humbled. We hold Jaime Lannister still. We hold many Lannister men. The Iron Throne might yield Sansa and Arya in exchange, and perhaps they will accept the independence of the North and the Riverlands, if they believe it's the only way to halt the bleeding. The Great John snorted. There's honor in that, but these are Lannisters we speak of. Roose Bolton inclined his head, voice coldly smooth. Lady Catelyn's point stands. They have reason to treat with us, if only to spare themselves further defeats. And if they do not, we still can proceed with a more aggressive plan. Robb heard them out, then spread his hands over the map. We'll do both. We'll send riders with fresh terms to King's Landing. We demand recognition of the king in the north, independence for the Riverlands bound with us, and the safe return of both my sisters, both not one. In exchange, we will release Jaime Lannister and cease hostilities, though our forces will remain in the Westerlands for as long as it takes to ensure the Lannisters comply. He traced a line on the map. Meanwhile, we'll move to position ourselves near Lannisport, but we won't launch a costly siege. We'll set up outposts on the roads. Harass supply wagons entering or leaving the city. Make them feel the pressure. With luck, that will either force Tywin to come back in haste or force the crown to the table. Catelyn let out a silent breath of relief. It was a measured plan, one that balanced boldness with caution. Most of the lords appeared mollified, though the Great John was still itching for a more glorious confrontation. Brynden Tully looked thoughtful, nodding. Roose Bolton gave a half-smile that did not quite reach his pale eyes. Robb pressed on. We'll also keep a watch on the roads north and east. If Tywin attempts a countermove, we must know the moment he crosses any pass or major river. I want outriders day and night. The slightest shift in enemy troop movement, we move accordingly. With that settled, the council broke into smaller discussions. The Blackfish conferred with a group of riverlords about how to hold newly captured strongholds. The Great John roared instructions to a messenger regarding the mustering of more Umber men who might come south if the roads allowed it. Roose Bolton withdrew to a corner to speak quietly with some of his own men, no doubt instructing them in infiltration or sabotage. Bolton's methods always carried a cold, sharp edge. Catelyn watched them all, keenly aware of the careful balancing act that allowed the northern host to function. Victory had drawn many under Robb's banner, but the seeds of conflict or betrayal could lie dormant until adversity struck again. At length, Catelyn left the warmth of the tent. Outside, the day had fully broken, thin sunlight spilling over the muddied ground. New fires were being lit to burn piles of debris, including broken siege equipment the Lannisters had abandoned. The acrid smoke stung her eyes, but she walked on, making her rounds among the men who loaded wagons and readied their horses. Some called out greetings to her or a quick "7 bless you, my lady." Though many believed she favored the old gods of the north in deference to Ned's ways, she answered them gently. She had been raised on the faith of the Seven in the Riverlands, of course, but was not above praying to any god who might hear. These men needed all the blessings they could get. She found herself reflecting on the choice they had made, forging a slow approach, a partial siege, sending fresh terms of negotiation. Though it grated at her to give the Lannisters even a sliver of trust, she knew it was the right step. Their mission was not the conquest of all Westeros, only the securing of the North, the Riverlands, and the safe return of her daughters. If Sansa and Arya were yet alive, the best hope was to force the crown's hand. Yet in her heart, Catelyn felt a dull ache that would not vanish. The memory of Ned's death, the uncertain fate of her daughters, and the harsh reality of war weighed on her. Even if they succeeded, how many more would die? There was no undoing the tragedy that had brought them here. She steeled herself, reminding herself that each measured step offered a chance for fewer lives lost. That afternoon, the northern host began its march westward, leaving behind a smaller force to hold the valley. Someone had to deal with the burying of bodies to keep the road secure from potential Lannister remnants. Despite the grimness, the soldiers rode with a sense of pride. They carried themselves as victors, the direwolf banners snapping in the breeze. Here and there, Catelyn spied the Tully trout, reaffirming her connection to the Riverlands. Together, they had become a single cause. They traveled at a measured pace, not wanting to exhaust their warhorses. Scouts scoured the countryside for any sign of Lannister ambush. The rumor was that some lesser Lannister lords, those not under Tywin's direct command, had begun to consider defection, or at least neutrality. The unstoppable tide of the young wolf was a strong inducement to shift loyalties, if only to protect one's lands. Robb encouraged those who approached him with offers of fealty, placing them under watchful guard to be sure they were sincere. The cunning of the South was always a worry, but if they could peel away even a fraction of Tywin's support, it might tilt the balance further in their favor. Catelyn often rode near Robb during the daytime marches, offering quiet suggestions. They spoke of forging stable governance, should they hold parts of the Westerlands through winter's end. She reminded him of the importance of stable coin and stored grain. No kingdom, no matter how valorous, could function if the men starved. Robb took it all in with solemn focus. She noted how quick he was to learn from each new challenge, how he delegated tasks to proven captains, how he corrected the unruly among his men with calm authority. He was not yet hardened in the way older lords might be, but in some ways that was his strength. He tempered practicality with compassion. Most nights, they camped in open fields or near a small hamlet. The men erected a ring of wagons for protection, posted sentries, and prepared simple meals. Robb would gather his commanders in a central tent to go over the day's scouting reports and plan the next steps. Catelyn joined him unless he needed privacy for certain military details. She found herself longing for a real bed, for the warmth of Riverrun's hearths, but she endured. This was the life they had chosen for the sake of the North. Nearly a fortnight after the victory in the valley, they came within sight of the southern roads leading toward Lannisport. Rolling hills spread out before them, dotted with vineyards and orchards. The air smelled faintly of the sea, though the coastline was still many leagues away. By midday, the outriders returned, bringing news of Lannister pickets scattered across the countryside, but no sign of a large centralized force. Either Tywin had not yet reformed his army or he was cunningly keeping it elsewhere. Robb ordered the men to set up a forward camp on high ground near a small lake. From there, they could see for leagues in most directions. Lannisport itself was not visible yet, blocked by the final ridge lines. Still, the tension grew among the northern ranks. Here they were, pushing deep into Lannister home territory. Even the Great Jon, normally boisterous, occasionally fell silent to peer across the horizon, as though expecting a lion's roar at any moment. That evening, as the campfire sprang to life, Catelyn found herself summoned to Robb's tent for a war council. She arrived to see the Blackfish, the Great Jon, Roose Bolton, and a handful of other key lords already gathered. Robb sat at a table lit by a trio of lanterns, poring over a fresh map with a thoughtful frown. "Mother," he said in greeting, "I've just received new reports. Several local landed knights have come forward to bend the knee or at least vow neutrality. They say that Lannisport is uncertain, lacking leadership, with only a small garrison to keep order. The gold flows, but the will to fight is not strong, not after the news of Tywin's defeat. We can probably encircle the city with minimal resistance." The Great John grinned broadly, curling a fist around a mug of ale. "Aye, so let's do it. Let's pound on the gates. Let them know the wolves are here." Robb shook his head. "Storming a walled city is no small feat. Lannisport is large, with thick walls near the water, and we don't have a fleet to blockade them by sea. If they bring in supplies by ship, we'd have a stalemate." Catelyn folded her hands before her. "Perhaps there's another way. If the city's garrison is small, and the people are unwilling to fight, we might attempt to negotiate directly with the city's leaders. They don't all bear the Lannister name. They're merchants, traders, craftsfolk. Many might prefer to pay a certain levy rather than see their city sacked." Roose Bolton's expression was impassive, but his voice was thoughtful. "If we come as conquerors, we risk uniting them out of terror. But if we come as an occupying power that offers them fair terms, they could welcome us. Then we'd have an outpost on the coast, threatening all Lannister shipping. And Tywin or Joffrey would be forced to respond." The Blackfish nodded. "We do well to avoid a protracted assault. Our strength lies in open battle, not in city sieges. Even the Great John must concede that battered men and meager siege engines won't bring down those walls easily." The Great John let out a gruff laugh. Fine. I'd rather face an army of lions in the field than huddle at walls for half a year." Robb drummed his fingers on the table. "So we attempt a parley with Lannisport. Offer them lenience if they open their gates and swear not to supply Tywin's forces. In return, we keep order, but we do not loot or burn the city. If they refuse, we make a show of force outside, cut off the roads, and see how their merchants fare with no trade. That might be enough to bring them to heel." Catelyn saw nods around the table. Robb's cunning approach once again balanced threat with negotiation, forging a path that might spare needless carnage. "We'll need a skilled negotiator," she pointed out. "Someone who can speak with their council or magistrates, perhaps Uncle Brynden or Roose Bolton, men who carry enough weight in name or presence to be taken seriously, but also a certain courtesy." Bolton's pale eyes slid toward Robb. "I will go, if you command it, Your Grace, but I imagine my reputation might alarm them more than reassure." The Blackfish gave a small snort. "And I'm Tully, a name not so beloved in these parts, but far less frightening than yours. Let me handle the initial talk. I'll bring a small escort, nothing that suggests a threat." Robb glanced between them. "Very well. Uncle, you will speak for me. Offer terms of neutrality and protection in exchange for letting us enter the outskirts. Let them keep their own governance if they prefer, as long as they do not harbor Lannister soldiers. We'll request provisions, of course, but we'll pay, and we will punish any soldier caught looting." Emphasized that. "I'd rather have the city intact than in flames." Catelyn felt a surge of approval. Robb had grown confident, and yet he had not lost caution or compassion. This was precisely the balance she had always hoped he would strike. At times, she recalled Ned's wariness of Southern cunning, but Ned was gone now. They faced a new world where they had to match cunning with cunning. The War Council ended on that plan, and Brynden Tully prepared to ride at dawn with a token escort toward the city gates. The rest of them settled in for another cold night under canvas. Catelyn lingered in Robb's tent, sharing a simple meal of bread and salt beef with him while gray wind prowled at the entrance. Robb tore a piece of bread, chewing thoughtfully. "Sometimes I wonder, Mother, if I'm leading our men further from home than we should go. The Westerlands are far from the Neck, the North, even the Riverlands. Winterfell feels a world away." She reached across the small table and took his hand. "I know, war always moves faster than the heart can bear. But you do this for the North's safety, for your sisters, for a future where no Southron king can threaten us again. You have come this far with wisdom and mercy. That is all I can ask." He stared at the flickering candle between them, voice quieter. "If I fail, if we all fail, I cannot bear that we risked so many lives. The men placed their faith in me." She squeezed his hand, thinking of how Ned had once carried the weight of the North. "You carry the burden of a king. No one else can bear it for you, but you are not alone. You have me, and your uncles and your bannermen. Even the men themselves, they want to see you succeed. If doubt troubles you, share it with me, and we will find the way." Robb closed his eyes briefly, then exhaled. "Thank you, Mother." In the morning, the Blackfish and his small party rode out to Lannisport. From a ridge, the northern lords watched them go, a modest column of fewer than 20 riders bearing Stark and Tully banners. The roads twisted through gentle hills, dotted with cypress and hardy shrubs. Farther off, one could glimpse the haze of the city perched by the sea, though the walls were too distant to see. Roose Bolton muttered that Lannisport was perhaps the richest port in Westeros after Old Town and King's Landing. Here, House Lannister's wealth flowed in gold coins and trade goods from distant shores. If they secured even partial control of the city, it would be an unimaginable blow to the Lannisters' coffers. While the Blackfish negotiated, Robb's host remained encamped behind the ridgeline to avoid alarming the city. Patrols circled the perimeter, ensuring that no hidden Lannister force approached from another direction. The tension was palpable. Everyone wondered if Lannisport would yield or if they would be forced into a siege. The hours dragged. Late that afternoon, a rider came galloping back, bearing a missive with the Blackfish's seal. Robb read it aloud to his close advisors and Catelyn. "Lannisport's leading council has agreed to hear formal terms from the king in the north. They will open their gates to a limited escort on the morrow. Hostages will be exchanged for security. The city wishes to avoid bloodshed but remains uncertain. I judge it possible we can secure peaceful entry if we reassure them of their safety and property." Catelyn let out a soft breath. It was better than she had dared hope. She saw the Great John scowl, likely disappointed there would be no epic fight, but calmer heads prevailed. Robb quickly wrote a response, confirming he would come in person with a small retinue to finalize terms. The next morning, the banners of House Stark and House Tully fluttered in the bright sun as Robb, Catelyn, Roose Bolton, the Great John, and a handful of sworn swords set off. Their main army remained in the hills, prepared to move at a moment's notice. The road curved downward. By midday, the walls of Lannisport rose before them. It was a handsome city by reputation, though overshadowed by the rock of Casterly Rock a few leagues west. Here were stout walls of pale stone, proud towers, and broad gates that opened onto a bustling port. Even from this distance, Catelyn could smell the tang of salt air and hear faint shouts from the harbor. The gates stood ajar, guarded by men in half-shined Lannister livery, but many wore uncertain expressions. From the battlements, a few archers peered down, arrows nocked but not drawn. The city's small folk watched nervously, but also curiously, from behind the guards. The Blackfish waited just outside, greeting Robb with a respectful bow. "They're uneasy, but I sense they'd rather avoid a sack. Few of Tywin's sworn knights remain here, most marched away and haven't returned. The city councilors are mostly merchants. They know your name and fear what the young wolf might do if refused." Robb dismounted. He was clad in boiled leather and a mail shirt, the direwolf sigil displayed on his surcoat. Gray wind padded at his side, eliciting gasps from some of the watchers. Catelyn suppressed a small smile. That monstrous direwolf could unnerve any city folk. Robb greeted the Blackfish warmly, then signaled for the party to approach the gate. A tense moment followed as the gates swung wider, and a delegation stepped forward. At their head was a stout man in fine robes, wearing a gold chain around his neck. Several lesser merchants flanked him, along with a few knights who did not look eager for combat. The stout man inclined his head. "Your Grace, we welcome you to Lannisport as guests, under the arrangements made with Ser Brynden Tully. I am Colmar Laygood, a counselor and merchant master, chosen to speak on behalf of the city." Robb eyed the small group calmly. "Well met, Master Laygood. I come in peace, so long as no harm befalls my men. We have terms to discuss. Terms that will ensure neither your city nor my host suffers needless bloodshed." Laygood did his best to appear dignified, though Catelyn saw the sweat beading on his brow. "We are prepared to hear these terms, your grace, so long as we can be assured that you have no intention of pillaging our homes or shops." The Great John let out a low chuckle. "We prefer our meals unspoiled, friend. No sense in smashing the place we might want to keep." Roose Bolton cast him a sidelong glance that made the merchant pale further. Robb's tone remained cordial. "If your city means no harm, you'll find we have no wish to burn or pillage. We do, however, require food, lodging for some of our men, and assurances that you will not harbor Lannister forces or supply them." Colmar Laygood swallowed. "We can see to that, but we ask in turn that your men not punish innocents or disrupt trade unnecessarily. We are a mercantile city. Trade is our lifeblood." Robb nodded. "Agreed. We shall pay for goods we require at fair prices, provided your merchants do not use this moment to line their pockets at the expense of my army. If your people prove cooperative, we will treat them with respect." With that, the negotiations continued within the gatehouse itself. The city watch parted nervously for the northerners. Catelyn walked beside Robb as they passed under the arch, feeling the eyes of the Lannisport folk upon them. Inside, the streets widened, lined with shops and homes of pale stone with red-tiled roofs. It reminded her vaguely of her visits to other southern cities long ago, though Lannisport's architecture had a certain proud flair. Golden lion emblems adorned some corners, reminding all who ventured here that this land was a seat of Lannister pride. Indeed, the watchers murmured in a mixture of fear and curiosity at the sight of the direwolf, at the tall, broad northern warriors. Robb's personal guard moved in disciplined formation, faces stern. Colmar Laygood led them to a hall used by the city council. There, on a dais, sat a handful of important men and women in anxious conference. Banners of the city, a golden harbor on a crimson field, hung behind them. They rose at the newcomers' approach. Laygood introduced them one by one. Master of docks, mistress of trade, a prominent moneylender, and a knight who claimed distant kinship with the Lannisters but quickly disavowed Tywin's heavier-handed politics. The tension in the air was thick. They all understood that if Robb so chose, he could muster his men to sack the city. Whether or not they could hold it afterward was a separate question, but the immediate power was his. The negotiations, however, took a more measured tone. Robb sat at a long table with Catelyn on one side, the Blackfish on the other. The Great John stood behind them, occasionally thumping a fist into his palm for emphasis. Roose Bolton, silent and watchful, seemed content to let others do the speaking. Over the course of an hour, they ironed out a temporary agreement. Lannisport would open its gates to the northern host, but no more than 3,000 soldiers would enter at any one time, enough for a garrison but not a full-scale occupation. Robb would establish a secure quarter by the harbor where his men could be housed without disrupting the daily life of the city. In exchange, the city would receive official orders that the northerners would not loot or assault citizens, under threat of Robb's own justice. Provisions and other supplies could be purchased at stable prices, enforced by a joint oversight council. Any attempt to smuggle in Lannister soldiers or arms from outside would be met with swift retribution. Robb would ensure that shipments of gold or trade goods from Lannisport to other parts of Westeros would be inspected for war materials. The city's commerce could continue, but not in a way that aided the Lannisters' war effort. For Lannisport, it was likely the best they could hope for, a lenient occupation that allowed them to go on living. For Robb, it gave him a foothold on the western coast and a show of strength that would echo across the sea lanes. News that the king in the north had marched into the proudest Lannister city without having to lift a battering ram would travel fast. Perhaps that would further demoralize Tywin's supporters. After they concluded, Master Laygood offered a strained smile. "Your Grace, we will begin to spread word that all loyal citizens of Lannisport should continue their lives as before. We only ask that your men exercise restraint." Robb rose, offering his hand. I give you my word that any soldier under my command who violates these terms will be punished. See that your own people do not provoke them. Let us all pray the war ends soon." When they stepped outside again, the day had grown warmer, with a breeze off the sea. Catelyn caught Robb's eye. The lines of worry in his face seemed a fraction lighter. "It went well," she murmured. He nodded, voice low. "Peaceful submission, or near enough. Far better than a bloody siege. We'll need to remain vigilant, but this is a victory of another kind, one less measured in bodies and more in position. Tywin will have to react." They made arrangements for the rest of the northern host to move closer. By dusk, a sizable contingent had entered the city, establishing a camp in a broad market square near the docks. Others set up on the plains just outside the walls. True to their word, the Council of Lannisport tried to maintain calm, though some merchants shuttered their shops out of fear. Others saw profit in the arrival of thousands of new customers. Catelyn's quick eye noticed how opportunists emerged: a fishmonger selling salted cod at inflated prices, a cloth merchant hawking northern-friendly garments. But most were subdued. War still loomed, and the city was adrift in the swirl of a realm's chaos. That night, Catelyn found herself in a modest villa offered by one of the city councilors for Robb's use. The local lord who owned it had fled with Tywin's army, so the property now served as a temporary seat for the king in the north. The columns of pale stone, the mosaic floors, the vine-draped courtyard. Everything felt unervingly luxurious compared to the canvas tents and muddy fields they had grown used to. A portion of Robb's guard patrolled the perimeter, while gray wind prowled the courtyard, sniffing at potted trees. A small staff of local servants, nervous, but apparently loyal to their city above all else, bustled in the kitchen. They presented a meal of roast capon, fresh bread, and spiced wine. Catelyn could not help but feel strange partaking of such fare in an enemy's domain, yet it reminded her of her upbringing in Riverrun. The southern flourishes in the cooking, the polished silverware, the lit torches that gave off a faint perfume of scented oil. It was an echo of a life lost to her since Ned's death. She sighed, seating herself at a table in a private chamber where Robb and a few lords joined her. The Great John took a massive seat, practically devouring half the capon at once. Bolton ate more delicately, cutting small bites. Robb was quiet, still wearing his mail, though he had removed his helmet. They spoke little as they ate, each lost in their own thoughts. Finally, Robb dabbed his mouth with a linen cloth and turned to Catelyn. "We're safe here for the night, but come morning, I want to send ravens to King's Landing. We'll tell them we have secured Lannisport. If they truly wish to keep their power, they'd best return my sisters and agree to our terms." He swallowed, a flicker of pain crossing his face. "Gods be good. I hope Sansa and Arya are still well." Catelyn reached across the table to clasp his hand. "They will be." She forced conviction into her tone, though fear gnawed at her. Queen Cersei would be a fool to harm them now, especially with Jaime in our custody and Tywin reeling. She wants leverage, not corpses. Bolton lowered his fork, expression mild. "Your Grace, if I may, the crown might be more amenable to negotiation, but we cannot forget that Lord Walder Frey expects certain promises from us. The crossing at the Twins still matters if we wish to hold the Riverlands or pass north again. He will press for your marriage vow, or some binding contract, before too long." The words weighed heavily in the air. That bargain with Walder Frey had opened the way across the Twins, but tied Robb's future in a knot. Catelyn felt a familiar knot of worry tighten in her stomach. "We cannot ignore the phrase," she said softly. "Lord Walder is too proud, too resentful if he thinks we've slighted him. But perhaps we can delay until we know if the war will end soon." Robb's face darkened. "I know my promise to Lord Frey. I will keep it if I must. Yet I don't relish wedding a Frey daughter I've never even met. And if peace comes by negotiation, perhaps he will settle for a different alliance. A betrothal to one of my bannermen, or a share of some new trade route we establish. Something that does not trap me in a marriage I do not choose." Catelyn saw the flicker of frustration in his eyes. He was 17, pressed by war to be a king, and now threatened with a forced marriage. She recalled her own betrothal to Ned, though that had been gentler circumstances, forged in the fires of Robert's rebellion but shaped by mutual respect and affection. She did not want to see her son trapped with a stranger for the sake of war. "We'll try to negotiate with Lord Walder if we can," she said gently. "But be mindful that he will not release you easily." Bolton said nothing, but an almost imperceptible smile curved his lips. The Great John let out a loud belch, draining his wine, and that broke the tension in the room. Men murmured their goodnights, rising from the table. Robb excused himself, instructing one of his captains to see to the night watch. Catelyn wandered into the courtyard, where a small brazier burned to chase away the chill. She stood near it, arms wrapped around herself, listening to the distant lap of waves against the harbor walls. The hush of the night in Lannisport felt different from the hush in the northern camps. More uncertain. There were so many unknowns. How the city's populace would react in the coming days, how Tywin might attempt to retake Lannisport, how the crown would answer their demands. She whispered a prayer, not entirely sure to which god she prayed. "Keep us safe. Keep my daughters safe. Let this war end before more blood must be spilled." Grey Wind padded over to press his muzzle against her side. She stroked the direwolf's thick fur, finding a glimmer of comfort in the warmth of the living creature. A moment later, Robb appeared in the archway, watching them silently. His face was drawn but resolute. "Mother," he said, stepping closer, "I wanted to thank you again." She let her hand fall from Grey Wind. "For what?" "For reminding me that cunning is as valuable as courage. Without your counsel, I would have tried to smash my way through every fortress, losing countless men. Now we stand in Lannisport itself with minimal bloodshed, which might bring us one step closer to peace." She exhaled slowly. "And if it fails to bring peace?" He looked up at the star-speckled sky. "Then we do what we must. The North won't bend to the likes of Joffrey or Cersei. Not after what they've done." In the following days, the northern occupation of Lannisport proceeded with surprising calm. The city watch was reorganized under joint supervision. A northern knight commanded the ramparts, while local sergeants kept their positions, which helped maintain order among the small folk. Robb's men established supply lines for food and fodder, paying with gold seized from certain Lannister storehouses discovered near the harbor. Rumors circulated that half the wealthy families in Lannisport were stashing their valuables in hidden vaults. But so long as they did not aid Tywin, Robb allowed them their secrets. A handful of minor skirmishes broke out when drunken soldiers brawled with locals. Robb dealt with each instance severely, fining the men or assigning them to labor duties. Word spread quickly that the king in the north did not tolerate rowdiness or cruelty towards civilians. This unexpected discipline further soothed local nerves. Catelyn saw how some city traders and craftsmen resumed normal life, even selling wares to the occupying forces. The impetus of gold, after all, was powerful. Meanwhile, ravens flew daily. Robb dispatched messages to King's Landing, reaffirming his terms: the North's independence, the Riverlands bound to the new Northern Kingdom, and the safe return of his sisters. Jaime Lannister would remain a hostage until those demands were met. Word came back sporadically, from the Crown, from the Baratheon claimants, from uncertain lords scattered across Westeros. The missives were often contradictory, rife with rumor. Some claimed Stannis was besieging King's Landing. Others insisted Renly was forging an alliance with the Tyrells. Still others whispered that Balon Greyjoy was building ships on the Iron Islands, seeing weakness on the mainland as an opportunity to strike. The entire realm was in flux, torn by the War of the Five Kings. When, at last, a raven arrived with the royal seal, the tension in Robb's makeshift hall was thick enough to taste. Catelyn, the Blackfish, Roose Bolton, and other lords stood by while Robb read the parchment. His face hardened. "The Queen Regent, or whoever truly writes these words on the Iron Throne's behalf," he said bitterly, "acknowledges our control of Lannisport as a flagrant act of rebellion against the rightful king. They refuse to yield the claim on the North or the Riverlands. They make no mention of Arya at all and merely say that Sansa's safe conduct might be considered in time. if we lay down our arms and release Jaime Lannister immediately. Impossible, Catelyn whispered, anger swelling. They offer us nothing. Robb crumpled the parchment in his fist. She does mention that all traitors to the crown will be dealt with swiftly upon surrender. This is a threat, not an offer. The Great John cursed loudly, pounding a table. Bloody Lannisters. They'd have us kneel just to cut off our heads. The Blackfish scowled. They likely have their hands full at King's Landing, so they stall us. By refusing any real negotiation, they hope we'll either wear ourselves out or make a fatal misstep. Bolton's voice was thin and calm. It seems, Your Grace, that no swift resolution will come from the Iron Throne. Not unless Joffrey's regime collapses first. Robb's lips were pressed into a line. Then we hold here. We dig deeper into the Westerlands, if need be. Tywin cannot ignore that we've taken one of his key cities. Sooner or later, he must respond, or see his lands slip further from his grasp. Catelyn felt both relief and dread. Relief that Robb would not yield to this insulting demand, and dread that the path forward meant more blood, more danger. The Lannisters had not broken. Far from it, they would gather their power anew. In the weeks that followed, Robb and his council orchestrated patrols beyond Lannisport's walls, forging alliances with more minor houses. Some capitulated swiftly, sending tokens of fealty and supplies. Others refused, slamming their gates, requiring the Northerners to threaten or lay short sieges. The Blackfish proved adept at coaxing or cornering them into surrender. House Marbrand, House Crakehall, House Lefford. Some sent cautious overtures, unwilling to commit but not openly hostile. The entire Westerlands stood on a knife's edge, with Tywin's name still carrying fearsome weight, but Robb's victory gave him an aura of inevitability. Occasionally, small Lannister forces tested Robb's outer lines, resulting in brief clashes. Each time, Robb employed the same cunning tactics, feints, hidden cavalry, swift strikes that had worked before. The Lannister knights often retreated in disarray, outmaneuvered by the young king they had learned to fear. Even so, the war was draining. Supplies dwindled. Horses needed fodder. The men wearied of living in a land not their own. Whispers began about what might be happening in the north itself. Would the Ironborn attempt raids on the coast? Would the wildlings surge past the wall? The realm was in chaos, and no place was truly safe. One crisp morning, Catelyn walked the docks of Lannisport, accompanied by a small guard and a mild-mannered merchant who had offered to show her the activity in the harbor. Sunlight sparkled on the green-blue waters. Ships rocked gently along piers of sturdy oak. Crews hoisted barrels of goods, likely heading to ports in the Reach or Dorne. Catelyn noted that some of the cargo was being inspected by northern soldiers. A handful of local fisherfolk glowered as they passed, but a few nodded politely. Perhaps they understood that occupation was better than a sacking. The merchant, a man named Harwell, explained, "Trade does continue, my lady, though the tensions hamper it. Some captains fear retribution if they're seen to do business with the usurping northerners. Others simply fear sailing with rumors of piracy along the coasts. It's said that Ironborn ships have been spotted in the Sunset Sea." He lowered his voice. "I pray they do not come here. The city has enough woes as it is." Catelyn frowned. The Ironborn are opportunists. If Balon Greyjoy sees that the Lannisters are weakened, he may raid the western shores, or he may strike at the north again. My husband once put down a Greyjoy rebellion. Balon has not forgotten. They continued past warehouses stacked with crates, some under northern guard. In one corner, a group of her son's men were scrawling notes on parchment, likely an inventory of seized Lannister property. A line of local workers stood sullenly by, awaiting instructions. The morning breeze carried the tang of salt and rotting seaweed. Catelyn tightened her cloak, her thoughts a storm of worries. She knew that if the Ironborn launched a serious attack on the north, the Lords of Winterfell might call for Robb's immediate return. Could they hold the Riverlands and the Westerlands while also defending the north against seaborne raiders? That question gnawed at her. On her return to the villa, she found a messenger waiting in the courtyard, dusty from hard riding, with a raven cylinder strapped to his belt. He bowed low. "My lady, I've come from Riverrun with tidings. Lord Edmure bids me deliver them to King Robb at once." Catelyn guided him into the main hall, where Robb sat in discussion with the Blackfish and the Greatjon. The messenger produced a letter. Robb read it, face grim. "My uncle reports that Tywin Lannister has appeared again at Harrenhal with a gathering of new forces, including some of the Mountain's men. They've put the Riverlands under fresh raids, though not in large numbers yet. Also, word from the Neck suggests that the Ironborn have grown bold on the northern coasts. Supposedly, they landed men at Stony Shore." The Greatjon roared a curse. "The Krakens are rearing their ugly heads, are they?" Robb rubbed his temple. "Indeed. There's more. Ser Roderick Castle has sent ravens from Winterfell, concerned about sightings of longships off Sea Dragon Point. No major invasion yet, but the Watchers are uneasy." He looked up at Catelyn, wearing the expression of a young man pulled in too many directions. "The war is beginning to tear the realm in every corner. We can't just stay here forever." Catelyn's heart sank. The cunning conquest of the Westerlands was a double-edged sword. It weakened the Lannisters, but it also tied Robb's forces far from home. "We need to decide which threat is greatest. Tywin might be planning a renewed push into the Riverlands, or the Ironborn might strike the north in earnest." The Blackfish spoke gravely. "If Tywin breaks into the Riverlands again, Edmure can hold Riverrun for a time, but not forever. The folk weary. Harrenhal is a cursed fortress, but it's also a formidable stronghold from which Tywin can raid across the Trident." Roose Bolton, who had joined them quietly, added, "Meanwhile, if the Greyjoys ravage the northern coast, your bannermen will look to you for aid, your grace. Dividing your army is risky, but ignoring one threat entirely is worse." A somber hush fell. Robb paced. "I cannot be in two places at once. The north is my birthright, but the Riverlands are my sworn allies, and so long as they remain part of my kingdom, I owe them protection. Yet we must not abandon what we've gained in the Westerlands. If we simply march away, Tywin's men might retake Lannisport in a matter of weeks." He looked to Catelyn. "What would you counsel, mother?" She took a steadying breath, gathering her thoughts. "We must do several things at once. First, fortify Lannisport's defenses, leaving behind a substantial garrison. Make it clear to the city council that if Tywin tries to retake it, they should rally behind our men rather than risk his wrath or a sacking from a pitched battle. Secondly, you could dispatch a portion of our army, perhaps under a trusted lieutenant, to rejoin Edmure in the Riverlands, helping secure the borders against Tywin's raids. Meanwhile, we send a strong detachment northward to reinforce White Harbor and the coastal defenses, to thwart the Ironborn. You, Robb, must decide where your personal presence is most critical." The Greatjon coughed. "We need you in the field, lad. You're the king in the north. The men fight better when you lead them." Bolton nodded slowly. "Your name is half our strength, but perhaps you should see to the north personally. If Balon Greyjoy seizes any of our key ports or, 7 forbid, attacks Deepwood Motte or Torrens Square, the north itself will be bleeding." Brynden Tully countered. "Yet if Tywin musters anew and threatens to retake the Riverlands, your uncle Edmure will be at risk. The men there need to see the king in the north leading them too." Robb breathed harshly, tension etched in every line of his face. "We can't be everywhere, but the north, I've sworn to protect it above all else. My father's seat. I cannot stand by if the Ironborn invade my home." He turned to his mother. "I might go north with a portion of our host. I could leave another contingent here in Lannisport under a reliable commander, someone like the Blackfish or Bolton, while we send a third force to aid Edmure. We'd be dividing our army, but each piece might hold a critical position." Catelyn gazed at her son, a swirl of pride and fear in her heart. "That is a sound plan, if we choose our commanders well and keep open lines of communication. The realm is fracturing. We must hold what we have carved out, not let it slip through our fingers." Robb clenched his jaw. "Let it be so. I'll lead a large force north to face the Ironborn threat. Greatjon, you'll come with me. Your men are well suited to rough battles." I'll also gather some of my best cavalry. Uncle Brynden, I'd have you remain at Lannisport with about 2,000 men to maintain order and be ready for a westward push if Tywin tries to come from that direction. Roose Bolton, I'll trust you to lead another portion of our forces back to Riverrun to reinforce my Uncle Edmure. You can coordinate with him to hold the trident. Keep me informed by Raven of Tywin's movements. Bolton inclined his head, giving that faint, cool smile again. As you command, your grace. I shall see that Harrenhal remains under watch, and if Tywin tries to strike, we'll be waiting. Catelyn's instincts prickled. Roose Bolton was cunning, perhaps too cunning. But in war, one sometimes had to trust men of uncertain moral character if they were effective. Be sure, she said quietly, to act in concert with Edmure, not in isolation. The River Lords will respond better to a Tully voice in the mix. Bolton's eyes flicked to her. Of course, my lady. The king's success depends on unity. With the plan set, they spent the following days organizing the partition of the army. Messenger ravens flew, instructing Edmure and local northern lords how to coordinate. Word spread through Lannisport that Robb Stark would soon depart, but that a garrison would remain. Some of the city's councillors worried about retaliation from Tywin, but the Blackfish assured them that the North's presence would be enough to deter a direct assault. Finally, on a bright morning, Catelyn prepared to depart with Robb's column. She looked out across the harbor one last time. The ships bobbed on the gentle waves, and the sun's reflection danced on the water. This city, once a bastion of Lannister pride, now lay under the direwolf banner. An astonishing feat, yet the war raged on, and the cost kept rising. Before mounting her horse, she stood beside Robb, who gazed up at the ramparts. Northern archers saluted from the walls. Down in the streets, a mixture of Lannister and Tully banners lined the thoroughfares. The Blackfish rode up, bowing in the saddle. All is ready here, your grace. Go with the gods. I'll keep this city firmly under your rule until you return. Robb clasped his uncle's hand. Thank you, uncle. Remember, if Tywin tries to retake Lannisport, hold as long as possible. We'll ride to your aid if needed. Brynden Tully's gray eyes flashed. He'll find this city a prickly prize indeed. Then it was time. With banners flying, Stark, Tully, Umber, and various lesser houses, the northern host split into two. Roose Bolton led a sizable force eastward toward the Riverlands, while Robb, Catelyn, the Great John, and a swarm of others turned north. The wind off the Sunset Sea whipped at them as they climbed the coastal roads. Lannisport shrank behind them, a sprawl of pale walls and red rooftops. Ahead lay the uncertain miles to the Neck, to Moat Cailin, and beyond. Catelyn felt a pang of both longing and dread for the north. She had not seen Winterfell since the day she left to save Ned. How changed it would seem now, perhaps under threat by Balon Greyjoy's raiders. Yet she carried within her a persistent ember of hope. If the north could be secured, if the Riverlands could hold firm, and if Tywin remained stymied in the Westerlands, perhaps the crown would finally negotiate in earnest. Already, ravens reported that King's Landing might be beset by Stannis Baratheon, by the Tyrells forging new alliances, by riots over food shortages. The Iron Throne was precarious no matter how Joffrey postured. In time, perhaps, the war would crack it wide open. The days turned into weeks of travel northward. The coastal road was rough, passing through stony cliffs and windswept hills. At intervals, they found fishing villages that had heard rumors of the young wolf's conquests. Most offered no resistance, occasionally bartering fish and simple provisions. Yet the sightings of ironborn longships grew more frequent. Several times, watchers spotted sails on the western horizon. The Great John pounded his chest, eager for a fight, but the ships never ventured too close. Perhaps they scouted, waiting for an opening. As they neared the boundaries of the north, the terrain shifted. Thick forests began to dominate, the air growing chill. Catelyn felt a rush of familiar bleak comfort. This was the edge of home, though her heart clenched at the memory of the last time she had ridden these roads with Ned. Now only Robb was at her side, a king instead of a boy. One evening, a bedraggled outrider found their camp, reporting that Ironborn reavers had attacked a small fishing settlement a day's ride north, leaving it in ashes. The men grew restless, vengeful. Robb's jaw set like iron. "We push on," he declared. "I'll not suffer the Greyjoys to raid our people." They pressed forward at an aggressive pace, even as the temperature dropped. The Greyjoy's men scouted ahead, sometimes skirmishing with pockets of Ironborn marauders. News trickled in from other outriders. Balon Greyjoy had declared himself king of the Isles and the North, sending his raiders to hold key points along the coast. The rumor was that Theon Greyjoy, Ned Stark's former ward, was spearheading some of these attacks, perhaps heading for Deepwood Motte or Torrhen Square. Catelyn felt a rush of anger and sadness at the thought of Theon turning cloak. But she reminded herself that war changed men's loyalties, and Theon's father had always hungered for independence. They crossed the neck with minimal trouble. Moat Cailin was in northern hands, and the Crannogmen seemed to respect Robb enough not to impede him. At last, the familiar pines and rocky fields of the northern coast stretched around them. The Great John led the vanguard, urging speed. The outriders reported glimpses of smoke on the horizon, signs of yet another Ironborn raid. Each day, the tension mounted, as if the land itself braced for conflict. When they reached the region near Deepwood Motte, they found it under siege or near enough. The Ironborn had established a rough encampment in the surrounding forest, though they had not broken the stronghold's walls yet. Smoke and the clash of steel carried on the wind. Robb wasted no time. He coordinated with the Great John and other lords to launch a pincer attack on the Ironborn lines at dawn. Catelyn stayed back with the reserves, remembering the early lessons of their war. A swift, cunning strike could break an overconfident foe. At first light, horns sounded through the misty woods. Northern men crashed into Ironborn positions, driving them from their crude barricades. The Ironborn fought fiercely, brandishing axes and seawater-warped shields. Robb led a cavalry push where the ground allowed, gray wind snarling at his side. The Greyjoy's roars echoed among the tall pines as he hewed down the reavers. Soon, the Ironborn realized they were outnumbered and started to fall back in disarray. Catelyn, positioned behind the lines, saw the enemy fleeing deeper into the forest. Some tried to regroup near a rocky outcrop, but the Karstarks and Glovers hammered them from the flank. By midday, the siege of Deepwood Motte was broken. Those Ironborn who survived fled northward, presumably toward the coast, hoping to reach their ships. Bodies littered the clearing around the walls, and northern archers atop the battlements cheered the arrival of the king in the north. Once Deepwood Motte's gate opened, Catelyn rode in with Robb. The lady of the castle, a Glover by marriage, hurried forward, half weeping with relief. She told them how Theon Greyjoy himself had not been present here, but rumors said he was targeting other keeps, possibly Winterfell itself. Robb's face turned white with fury at that prospect. "I left Theon as a friend at Winterfell," he said, voice tight. "If he dares strike at my home, I'll—" He did not finish, but his grip on the reins trembled with rage. Catelyn's heart sank. Another front opened, more danger. Their entire war had begun to spin outward in unexpected directions. Even as they emerged victorious in battle after battle, new threats arose like heads of a hydra. She reflected on how, ironically, the cunning that had brought them so far might be overshadowed by the chaos unleashed in the rest of the Seven Kingdoms. No matter how deftly they outmaneuvered the Lannisters, the Greyjoy threat could tear the north from within. They spent a day securing Deepwood Motte, seeing to the wounded, organizing a plan to chase down the fleeing Ironborn. Robb took counsel with the local lords, many of whom had been pinned inside the walls for weeks. They spoke of scattered attacks along the coast and the possibility that the Ironborn had seized or sacked Torrhen Square. Despair tinged the conversation, but Robb steadied them with measured words. He would not rest until every Ironborn reaver was driven from the north. The men rallied to him with new zeal. Late that evening, alone by the castle's small hearth, mother and son conferred in hushed voices. Catelyn placed a comforting hand on Robb's shoulder. "We will push them out, Robb. You've proven you can defeat armies far larger than these raiders." He stared into the flames, jaw clenched. "I was a fool to trust Theon, or even to let him go back to Pike as an envoy. If father were alive, he might have foreseen Balon's treachery. Now our home is threatened. Catelyn gently turned him to face her. Ned wanted peace with the Iron Islands, or at least a stable accord. He never foresaw the war coming from the Crown's betrayal. None of us saw the future clearly. Don't heap blame on yourself for wanting to avoid more bloodshed. What matters is what you do now. He sighed. And what we do next is push onward. I must see to Winterfell's safety. If Theon truly leads men there, his voice quavered. Bran and Rickon are still there, as is little Rickon. If any harm befalls them, Catelyn's heart squeezed. She had almost let the war push her younger boys from her immediate thoughts. Then let us go, Robb. Let us hurry to Winterfell's defense. We can't lose more of our family. He inclined his head, eyes burning with fierce determination. We ride tomorrow at dawn. At that, Catelyn felt a grim sense of purpose settle over her. The war had changed them all. She had guided Robb to be cunning, to conquer and outmaneuver the Lannisters, to show mercy without weakness. Yet in the end, it was still family that drove them forward. Whatever awaited in the far-flung corners of the realm, Tywin's resurgence, King's Landing's intransigence, or the uncertain politics of the South, none of it mattered as much as protecting their own blood at Winterfell. If Theon had truly betrayed them, if Balon Greyjoy sought to rip the North from beneath them, they would answer with the same cunning and ferocity that had made the young wolf's name feared. So the northern host prepared to move again, deeper into the heart of the North. Messenger ravens flew, calling the loyal bannermen to arms. Along the coasts, watchers lit signal fires whenever ironborn sails appeared. Perhaps Tywin Lannister believed them pinned by the Greyjoy threat. Perhaps that was part of his plan. Yet Catelyn could only think of Bran and Rickon in Winterfell's halls, waiting for a salvation that must come at once. She offered a prayer to the old gods, under whose branches Ned once bowed, for safe passage and a victorious homecoming. When the dawn broke, cold and sharp, the king in the north rode out from Deepwood Motte, dire wolf at his side, mother at his back. His banners flew in the wind, as they had from the Twins to Riverrun, from Riverrun to the Westerlands, from the Westerlands back to the forests of the north. In each place, war had tested them. In each place, they had endured. Now they would be tested once more, not by the proud lions of the west, but by the iron krakens of the sea. Yet Catelyn Stark believed in her son as never before. A leader of men, shaped by victory and heartbreak, forging new alliances, balancing steel and subtlety like two edges of the same blade. With each hoofbeat, the North thundered its defiance, and she knew that no foe, not Tywin, not Greyjoy, not even the uncertain crown in King's Landing, could easily stand against a king in the North who had learned to conquer not just with raw might, but with the steady, unyielding cunning of a mother's wisdom and a wolf's relentless heart.